Harry Neufeld testified that neither the minister nor his staff ever contacted him. Quote, "I was waiting for that call, but it never came." He also said that Conservatives are, quote, "tilting the playing field in their direction." Well, the minister repeatedly uses Mr. Neufeld's report to support his unfair actions. So why didn't the minister consult the author of that report?
According to Mr. Neufeld's report, there were 45,000 instances where there was no record kept of the voter and the voucher. That removes the safeguard. That is unacceptable. The Fair Elections Act will fix that.
Okay, now that is the NDP's Deputy Leader Megan Leslie sparring with the Minister of State for Democratic Reform, Pierre Poilievre, in the House today. Mr. Poilievre is standing by to talk to us in just a minute, but over his hugely controversial election reform bill. Today, an elections expert who authored the report that's much quoted, frequently touted by Minister Poilievre to support his bill, appeared before a committee of MPs. His name, Harry Neufeld, and he had some very sharp criticisms for the reforms, especially the plan to do away with the vouching system. But the big moment came when Mr. Neufeld said his report had been selectively read and selectively quoted by the minister to exaggerate the prevalence of voter fraud. Did Mr. Poilievre twist Mr. Neufeld's word? We're going to hear from Mr. Poilievre in a minute. But first, let's hear from the former British Columbia elections chief, Harry Neufeld. Harry Neufeld, good to see you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan.
You testified in front of committee today. The government has widely quoted your report, Mr. Poilievre, who's coming up, to use it to legitimize the Fair Elections Act. In your view, are they using your report in a fair and honest way to justify this bill?
Unfortunately not. I think it's been a very selective reading of my report and selective quoting as well.
Let's talk about that. On the issue, one of the quotes in the report, and I'm going to they say, quote, "Serious errors of a type that are considered serious irregularities can contribute to an election being overturned. They were found to occur in 12% of all election day cases involving voter registration, 42% of cases involving identity vouching." That's your report. Mr. Poilievre quotes that to say, see, 42% of cases involving vouching. What do you say to that?
Definitely there are serious errors. They're mostly errors of documentation being done inadequately, being done with a shorthand, or not being done at all. And it should be done. It's in the law that it's supposed to be done. It's one of those basic requirements to establish eligibility in the vouching process. And it could be improved through administrative mechanisms. But the minister is saying that that's not impossible, that will be impossible, and we're going to simply get rid of it. Not saying maybe we better look at an alternative, and there are some alternatives, and I outlined them for the committee this morning, just saying we're going to take this off the table.
Getting rid of vouching, what will the consequence be?
Well, if the last election is any indication, 120,000 people are going to want to, or going to need to be able to have some mechanism to vote that doesn't involve showing proof of their address, and they're going to be out of luck. They're simply going to be turned away.
What do you say to the minister when he says, but look, in your own report, there's potential of fraud. There's all this potential fraud. What's your response to the fraud argument?
Well, there's no evidence of fraud at all. There was no evidence in the court cases that led to the Etobicoke decision. There's evidence from studies in Australia, in the United States, here in Canada. I've been involved in fraud studies myself. Voter fraud, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist in Canada. There's other types of election fraud that may exist, but people impersonating themselves and risking that they're going to go to jail for 5 years or they're going to get a $5,000 fine, it just doesn't happen.
During your testimony, Minister Poilievre was tweeting out quotes of your report back to justify his position. Then, during question period today, he quoted your report again. Here's what he said.
Ensuring voter eligibility through the administration of these special exemption procedures is an expected part of an elections officer's duties. Errors that involve a failure to properly administer these procedures are serious. The courts refer to such serious errors as irregularities, which can result in votes being declared invalid. Mr. Speaker, those are serious problems. They remove, when those safeguards are not followed, they increase the risk that the result can be overturned by a judge. And, Mr. Speaker, we're solving that problem through the Fair Elections Act.
He's using your report as a basis for eliminating vouching in this bill. What's your response to that?
Well, perhaps vouching does need to be eliminated, but if it is going to be eliminated, it needs to be replaced with something else that's equally effective in ensuring the franchise is available to all Canadians who meet the eligibility criteria. That is, they're Canadians, they're 18 years of age, and they live in the district in which they're voting. And this is guaranteed in the Charter under Section 3. This is guaranteed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is guaranteed by other international treaties that Canada is a signatory to. You can't just take away people's right to vote because you think that there's an administrative problem.
You say he's selectively cherry picking from your report. If he was sitting across from you, what would you explain to him when he uses these quotes to legitimize getting rid of vouching? What would you tell him?
I tell him, Pierre, read the whole context. There's more to this. The Supreme Court says if there are irregularities, that's the first test. The second test is there has to be proof that people actually voted when they were not eligible to, or they voted more than once. There was no proof in the Etobicoke court case, and there's no proof that I've seen anywhere in the study or elsewhere in Canada in my election experience.
What do you make of today Lori Hahn, who was on the committee questioning you, a Conservative MP who will now appear on committee, saying back in the year 2006 he got a call suggesting people use the voter ID card perhaps to fraudulently vote? What do you make of this allegation? And of course there was Mr. Butt, another Conservative MP, who admitted that he'd openly made up an eyewitness account that he'd seen voter fraud take place.
I'm very interested to hear what Mr. Hans has to say when he actually gets to his testimony. But I wonder why he didn't report this in 2006 instead of now in 2014. If these things happen, and when I was Chief Electoral Officer of BC, I would hear these rumors as well among political circles that there's rampant fraud going on. I think it's an urban myth. And, you know, I would always say, please, provide some evidence. We'll investigate it. It never happened. It never came.
Mr. Poilievre, I asked him about this. Mr. Meron said the same thing, saying that they have a solution to a problem that doesn't exist because there's no acts of fraud that have come forward. And he said, I'll quote him, how does he know with all these cases, these 40-odd thousand cases, he never bothered to investigate? What's your response to that?
Well, all around the world, election administrators don't investigate unless there's evidence, unless there's serious allegations, unless there's something to base it on in terms of a complaint. I think Mr. Meron is right. You don't go chasing shadows for no reason, spending public money on doing investigations when there's no evidence and no complaints, no even anecdotal evidence that suggests that this is happening.
If this bill is passed without amendments, what would be your key concern for the consequences?
Well, one concern is that probably 120,000 people are going to be disfranchised as a result of the elimination of vouching. With the complete dismissal of the voter information card as a form of address ID, another 400,000 people are going to be disenfranchised.
400,000?
That's the estimate Elections Canada has of the number of people who, in that very limited subset that they sent voter information cards to and allowed them to use it as address ID, that's the number that used it and required that in order to get a ballot.
And by the way, when Mr. Poilievre says, no, we provide 39 pieces of ID without the voter ID card, they have 39 other options. What do you say to that?
I say that, yes, many people would have no problem showing 2 pieces of ID. The problem is the second piece of ID, verifying your residential address, is the challenge. I've got a wallet full of cards. My driver's license has got my address on it. All the other things have got my name on it.
Right.
And that's the issue for most Canadians. And increasingly, there's less and less mail coming. And right now, the ruling is you can't take in an electronic printout of your utility bill because, you know, electronic bills are easily manipulated. This is an area where there could be fraud. And so There's just fewer and fewer pieces of ID in people's hands that can prove their residential address.
Mr. Neufeld, now you're saying 120,000 people could be disenfranchised if vouching is outlawed. If you get rid of the voter ID card, another 400,000, that's 520. What other concerns do you have if this bill is passed unamended?
Well, there's one other major concern, which is the partisan appointment of election officials, the people who actually work in the polls. It used to be that it was only the deputy returning officer and poll clerk, and they work as a team. The party that won the last election, or would have won it under redistribution, they had the ability to appoint the deputy returning officer, who was really in charge of that poll. And the party that came in second had the ability to do that with the poll clerk. And the idea was, historically, that they kind of kept an eye on each other. And maybe there's a rationale for that, although I think the day is past on it. The new feature is that there's a poll supervisor in the larger polling places with multiple polling stations. They're going to be appointed by the candidate for the party that won the last election. If the candidate doesn't appoint the constituency association can. If the constituency association can't, the party can. And I think that starts to tilt the level playing field, and that's not appropriate in a 21st century democracy.
This thing there's a lot of attention to this. Have you ever seen anything like this? A bill about elections getting this much attention?
Never. Normally they're very boring.
Just as a last reaction, your name, as you know, you've been used on both sides, the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the NDP. They've all talked a lot about Harry Neufeld and the Neufeld report. But the government has really used your report to justify it. On the last view, when I have Mr. Poilievre in this seat in a number of minutes, I want to, again, is there one message you have to him about your report that you want to clarify how he is characterizing your report?
The key message is there is no evidence of fraud with the irregularities, the administrative irregularities of vouching. Please, if you're going to get rid of vouching, replace it with something else that's an equivalent that allows the franchise to continue for those Canadians who have difficulty providing evidence of both their identity and their current address.
In other words, there's a difference between irregularities and fraud.
Huge difference.
Harry Neufeld testified before a committee. The Neufeld report obviously at the center of this debate. I very much appreciate you having you here, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan.